Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 29 of an exciting new series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at U.A? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Bloomerbill on Fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Sorahiko would never regret teaching Nana's brat how to hide away and remain entirely off the grid effectively. But there were days he hated how dim and paranoid the ZYGT had become from it. However, rightfully terrified, he should be given the circumstances. Because he had only one way to contact Toshinori, and unfortunately, the boy just never returned his calls these days, which was a change from before the BSDRD's supposed death, although he only called him once every other month. Usually, Sorahiko would just curse the idiot out for ignoring him, but given he had learned that the grand old BSDRD himself was still around, he had to warn the ZYGT to get ahead of whatever that man had planned for him. So, for the past 2 weeks, he had been searching around for the ZYGT and had to admit the stealth lessons he gave Toshinori were sticking a bit better than he thought they would. Sure, when All Might appeared, it was near impossible to miss the big doofus, but nobody could find him after the fact, or even be certain where he had come from. And the few times he spotted the deflated version of the ZYGT, it was always in the background as a bystander completely unconnected to the goings-on. Which was not helping him to find the blonde. Did not help there were not any activity on the kid's real name either, but that was just another thing he recommended the kid to do since there was a 50-50 on whether the BSDRD knew the ZYGT's real name. That did not mean it would be impossible to find Toshinori. Just a hell of a headache while he looked for him. And what a headache, it was the only surefire way to track the ZYGT down was the high-maintenance diet he had to keep up to prevent his body from ripping itself apart from a lack of body tissue. Something that would be so much harder, given Toshinori no longer could eat proper food PRD and would need to rely solely on alternatives. The list of which would be a short one, given Toshinori could not cook to save his life. A lesson that stuck with Sorahiko, since even with him trying for 10 years could not stop the fool from burning a pot of water without direct and constant supervision. So the ZYGT making anything at home was a bust, and Sorahiko focused instead on looking into health stores that sold protein shakes and other places that sold meal replacement shakes like at mutation shops. And that took him well over a week to find which ones Toshinori used regularly. And once again in a lesson Sorahiko couldn't remember the boy grasping at the time. The kid had no set schedule for which ones he visited or when. The ZYGT even went to shops that weren't the ones he used regularly once in a while to further throw people off. Sorahiko would be proud in almost any other circumstance, but currently Toshinori's paranoia was not helping him. However, begrudgingly, he thought the ZYGT's caution was compared to when they first started training. Sorahiko eventually merely had to settle for just waiting for the ZYGT at one of his regular places to have a chance to speak with him. Sorahiko ended up waiting for about 3 more days before the man finally returned to the shop Sorahiko was watching. Of course, while Toshinori was better at some things, the ZYGT was still as clueless as he ever was in other respects. This was especially given with Toshinori only walking into the shop with a hat and mask to hide his face. It was not as bad as Sorahiko would make it out to be, given Toshinori looked vastly different from his heyday self when he was using his quirk, but if anyone real determined like himself started looking in the right places, they would figure it out eventually. Like All for One could do, and perhaps already had. Leaving the library across from the shop, Sorahiko quickly moved to intercept Toshinori before he could go inside. "You trying to avoid me, damn ZYGT?" he questioned, giving the boy a light whack with his stick on the shin. Toshinori jumped with a hiss and looked at him shocked. "Gee, Gran Torino," Toshinori exclaimed, clearly shocked and looking a bit faint. "Not so loud. And I ain't in costume either, or have you gone blind since I last saw you?" Sorahiko scolded with another whack to the boy's shins, and Toshinori hissed, Sorry, Torino-sensei." Toshinori replied instantly, waving his hands in surrender. Sorahiko shook his head, grumbling. "Well, what are you doing here, Torino-sensei?" the ZYGT asked. Sorahiko scoffed, narrowing his eyes at the blonde. "Well, if you'd return any of my calls or bother to listen to the 10 voicemails I left you, you'd know I have something very important to tell you. In person, you ZYGT," he gruffly told him in return. Toshinori began sweating. Now isn't the best time, Torino Dash, the blonde tried to explain, but Sorahiko did not give him the chance. No ZYGT. We need to talk now. He sternly cut off, glaring at Toshinori. The boy gulped, hanging his head. Why yes, Torino-sensei. Toshinori muttered, looking sufficiently cowed, so Sorahiko began walking down the street. There was a park nearby, and he would tell Toshinori there instead. He would not want anyone to overhear them. After making sure the two of them would be mostly alone and that they were far enough from the other people at the park, he checked multiple times that Toshinori was still following him before Sorahiko settled down at a gazebo. He took out a small device, placed it beside him, and clicked the red button on top of it, guaranteeing that no one would overhear them via devices. It was not cheap to get this, but it was clearly worth it to buy something that would make this a dead zone temporarily. Sorahiko let out a sigh, then turned to the ZYGT. Toshinori sat across from him, uncomfortably hunched in on himself like he always did, nervously fiddling with the large sleeves. It had been a while since he had seen Toshinori in person, and though he knew the boy had been working far too strong against doctor's orders, Sorahiko could not help a small twinge he felt in his heart as he got a good long look at Toshinori's sorry state. Toshinori was thin enough to see the hint of bone in places, especially in his face, the loss of weight no doubt caused by a combination of stress, dietary restrictions, and lack of true self-care. And the clothes he chose to wear certainly did not help this impression, with them being 4 sizes too big for him, and scruffy ones at that. Sorahiko shook his head, mentally scolding himself to get on with what he needed to tell the ZYGT, and that he could get on Toshinori's, but about all the things he was doing that would send himself into an early grave. I ain't gonna sugarcoat this kid, the BSRD's back. Sorahiko bitterly informed the ZYGT. Toshinori blinked, and it took the boy a second only for him to become pale, as he realized that there could only be one person Sorahiko could be talking about. How could I smash his brains, Torino-sensei? He can't still be alive? Toshinori fumbled over his words before going to denial, choking up some BLD halfway through. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, ZYGT, but you can't forget he has a bunch of quirks that can mess with your head. He can't convince you to give him one for all with them, but he could certainly make you think you killed him. Sorahiko replied. Toshinori's mouth opened to argue, but why wouldn't he do something then? He would have done something by now. Sorahiko, scared, and Toshinori immediately backed down. Do you think I know what goes on in the ancient BSDRD's head? If I had to guess, though, I think he is planning on waiting you out. He countered. Toshinori tensely stared back at him. Wait me out? He questioned, almost meek. Sorahiko nodded. As much as I'd hate to say it, you'd be likely to go before me if you keep this up. Doubt you'd last more than 2 years at this point, he said with a frown. Toshinori flinched and curled up in himself even further. And eventually you're either going to have to pass on the quirk or die with it, Toshinori. Either way, a couple years won't be a long wait for someone like him. Sorahiko further pointed out. That won't happen. I will not let that happen. I'll get rid of him before he can act, Toshinori stubbornly said. But Sorahiko swiftly whacked his knee with his walking stick, and the man coughed up more BLD. Like hell you can. Your body is failing you, ZYGT. It's been failing for years now because you couldn't listen to any of us about taking a damn break for once in your life, you idiot. Sorahiko scolded coldly. And now you can't last more than a few hours using one for all. Do you really think you could take him now, when you couldn't kill him in your prime? You're an optimist, but you are not that naive. He hissed at the blonde. Toshinori, having calmed down from his choking, wiped some of the BLD with a black handkerchief, but said nothing, clearly forced in a silence from his shame. Sorahiko took a deep breath. As much as I'd hate to say it, I think you need to listen to Greenie and find a successor, so you can pass one for all on to someone else, he told Toshinori, which made him choke up more BLD. Well, you want me to pass this on to someone else? To put that man's attention on someone else? Toshinori angrily questioned, the BLD droplets coming from his mouth, making him more intimidating. Sorahiko would have hit him again for giving him such lip, but he had not reacted much better when Greenie tried to get him to talk Toshinori into doing it either. Even now, the idea was very distasteful in his mouth. You won't have a choice. One for all is of the few things that we know can stop him, and if you don't pass it on, it will be gone for good when you die, and all that Nana and her family died for would be for nothing. Sorahiko hissed, making Toshinori flinch back and away from him, as if Nana's spirit had slapped him. Sorahiko knew it was a low blow to bring up Nana in such a way, but if it made Toshinori understand exactly how dangerous it was for him to keep going on like this, then Sorahiko would SCK it up. You need to try and find a successor in Fast ZYGT, because who knows how long we'll have before that BSTRD will remain on the sidelines before he strikes again. And that's not mentioning your own time crunch of maybe 3 years to train them if you quit dragging yourself through the gutter. Sorahiko said. There was a creak from the wood of Toshinori's seat as his grip tightened, clearly still very opposed to the idea of it, his eyes a mix of anger and despair. Sorahiko met his former pupil's eyes with an even-leveled glare. I don't like this any more than you do, Toshinori. He spat, and there was a crack that time when he squeezed on the bench, and the wood in his hand splintered. The blonde never liked it when he said his name for some odd reason, and rarely went by it when he could get away with it. If there was any other choice, I wouldn't be telling you to drag someone else into this mess. But unless you found some magically quirk that's a fountain of youth, we have exactly 2 options here. Pass on One for All to some poor sap and try to help them, or let One for All die with you and lose our only weapon against the BSDRD. Sorahiko elaborated, his grip on his walking stick making his knuckles white. The 2 were silent for quite a few minutes. Without a word, Toshinori stood up and shuffled away, leaving him alone in the gazebo, and Sorahiko sighed. It would be a wonder if the boy would listen to him, because he was certain that Toshinori had planned to die with One for All, and that it might take nothing short of the ghost of Nana herself to slap some sense into the boy. Maxooth wasn't quite sure how he ended up in this position, but frankly speaking, he didn't necessarily hate it either. Paintball matches were a semi-common occurrence in the 3rd year of the hero course, either dividing the class into 2 sides to fight, or by having the class as a whole fighting him and the heroics teacher for the year. There were the times where they'd arrange for the sister classes fight each other, but that was kept sparingly, since Ken was pretty competitive, and that unfortunately had been rubbing off on the students more in recent years. It certainly came to a head this week when Ueno's harassment of Togata led to assault and the poor kid's mental breakdown in Shizenji's office. Hopefully Nezu's talk with Ken afterwards was just scarring enough for Ken to take it down a notch. He'd feel bad for Ken, but the man definably brought it upon himself after he pointedly ignored their concerns about Togata's avoidance of his classmates. Hopefully things won't be so bad now that the 3 instigators weren't around. And if it wasn't, then Togata could easily join 2A instead, and they'd have a discussion about which of the students left would continue. A paint pellet whizzed past his head, and Maxooth quickly ducked and moved to another place for cover. Asterisk in the middle of match suds. Asterisk Maxooth scolded himself, quickly holding up a mirror to see around the corner, and only caught a glimpse of green before it moved out of sight. Asterisk DM in it. Asterisk he cursed in his head. Asterisk he's going to try and smoke me out. Asterisk he thought as he panted under his mask. I had been years since he last had a match as intense as this one, and he'd be a right liar if he said it wasn't a bit thrilling. He hadn't known Midoriya was licensed to carry a gun, much less had one on him at all times when the kid came up to him that morning. He'd been sent by Ito-san to help in the usual firearms demonstration he gave the 3rd years, but hell if it wasn't a big mistake to think the kid couldn't meet him toe-to-toe. His shots weren't as accurate as his own, but that hardly mattered when the kid had just about everything else working in his favor. Midoriya's frame was on the smaller side, and he was lean, which gave a much smaller target for him to work with, and the kid was smart and fast enough to use the urban area to his advantage. He was certain that when they reviewed the footage later that it would only reinforce to the others the reason for Midoriya's reputation in the underground wasn't earned just from his brain. Midoriya might not have used it against his students, but he demon well could hold his own in a firefight. Midoriya's students probably knew he was a stronger opponent than he looked, and was another reason that kept people from going against the boy. Despite his lack of formal training, Midoriya wasn't just holding his own, but actually had him on the run. And if this wasn't just a showcase for the students, he wouldn't be enjoying it as much as he was. It was a guilty pleasure of his to have a shootout like this. And to have someone he could have a more real fight with than he usually would was a delight. Maxooth knew better than to stay in one place, and he moved to go further into the apartments Midoriya had forced him into. He didn't like fighting in these kinds of places, because it was very restrictive in what he could do. The series of apartments didn't have much in the way of cover, and the tight quarters wasn't ideal. Midoriya managed to be a pain from a distance, and Maxooth had no doubts. that he'd be even worse in a close combat situation that the apartments would lead to. The halls weren't much better by comparison, but the trade-off of cover for space was currently speaking worth it. Sulking around the halls brought him back to his days before he broke into the limelight circuit. Midoriya had cut the power to the building, and the inside was sparingly lit by the occasional window, a scene that was definitely pulling him back to his time, searching through old warehouses and the like. And that was another thing that he'd picked up on Midoriya. He knew not only how to use the environment to his advantage, but to mentally off-put his opponent. Back in the open, where they started, Midoriya used his slightly faster reaction times to make fighting in the open a nightmare, taking the high ground, and had no hesitation to chuck whatever he could get his hands on straight at him, including his ammo. He kept wipes for the glass of his mask goggles, but if he hadn't, he'd been unable to see anything from his left side. The only reason the headshot hadn't caused him to lose was because Midoriya hadn't thrown it was enough power in it to be a true headshot. He had gotten in a few hits before this, but they weren't killing blows, so the two of them were very much still in this fight, and currently speaking, Midoriya still had the high ground on him, so to speak. The kid's experience in the districts was clear as day when he watched Midoriya weave seamlessly through fire escapes when he was still trying to outrun the kid. And he wouldn't doubt that Midoriya was more adept at fighting indoors than he was. Maxooth had to be careful of every step he took as he turned the corners. His body was tense as he half expected Midoriya to jump him at any second and start another to be started to his disadvantage. He jumped at every creak in the building, and he ended up pointing his gun at nothing but the empty corridors more than once as he moved through the build, which would be slightly embarrassing in the replay later, but he was more worried about not letting Midoriya to get the jump on him. It felt like an eternity before something finally happened, and upon hearing something bump into one of the side tables, he whirled another and shot off 2 rounds. The hissing shriek of a cat in reply made him jump, but indeed saw there was an orange tabby he almost shot before the poor thing ran off. Well, strays wandering into the fake city areas wasn't uncommon, and he probably would have caused the cat to become sick if it licked off any paint that got onto its fur. Shaking his head, Maxooth turned around planning to get lost before Midoriya came to investigate the racket he made. A sudden and very swipe of a knife to his throat made him jolt back, quickly nearly losing his balance, and he tried to reach for his guns. But the barrel of a pistol was just as quickly pressed directly towards where the apex of his neck met the underside of his chin. The shot that was fired next, unsurprisingly, was much worse than a throat punch, and Maxooth loudly choked as he was flung back and desperately tried to get back some sir as he fell onto his back. He turned on his side with quick gasps and heavy panting with a hand on his throat and Mukadalum. He choked out as he regained his bearings. "Ah, I'm so sorry, Snipe-san. Are you okay? Should I get recovered dash?" Midoriya said near immediately as he knelt to Maxooth's side, but he quickly raised a hand to silence the boy. "And nah, just give me a second, Deku-san." Maxooth shakily told the greenette as he recovered and forced himself up to his feet, but leaned on a nearby wall for security. Did Maxooth ever mention how much he hated it when people went for the throat? Because it really sucks, and Maxooth was sure to be feeling this for the next 3 days, at least bloody hell. Throat hits were right up there with being stabbed in the gut and how much they sucked. And as someone who's been stabbed in the gut more than once, he could say it was 2. Shaking his head, he took a deep breath through his nose. "Well, congrats on winning, Deku-san," Maxooth said, though his voice was still rough, and pushed off of the wall and stood up again, and he took stock of himself. There were some green splotches on his clothes here, or there along with one big one on his upper left bicep, but it wasn't that much damage all things considered other than the throat shot. His right hand also had green on it from when he clutched his throat. Midoriya was a right sight covered in far more purple paint than he was, and he almost got Midoriya out a couple of times from where his shots were. "Thanks, Snipe-san. We should go back to the students now, yes?" The boy guessed, just a touch unsure as he carefully watched Maxooth. Maxooth nodded. "Yep. You kids get all that?" he asked, bringing his hand up to the comms in his mask. "Most of it, Snipe-sensei. We couldn't remember which button was for the night vision." One of the students answered him, and he hummed in reply. "That's all right, kid. I recorded everything, so I'll just SWCH it to the night recording when we get back there," he assured me as he and Midoriya walked out of the building together. It took them about 5 minutes to return to the observation area where the kids were, all 15 students standing there in their costumes waiting for them. "Alrighty, kids, before we review the footage, anyone want to tell us what they noticed during the fight?" Maxooth inquired. The students shuffled around a bit before the class president, A girl named Doi raised her hand. Doi, Maxud said with a nod, encouraging her to speak. Doi hesitated for a second. Deku-san took advantage of his size to use smaller objects for cover, which wouldn't work for a larger person, like a garbage can lid. Doi said, playing with one of her twin ponytails. Maxud nodded again. That's correct. When in a fight, you can't just account for things that will be to your advantage, but your opponent's advantage where you're fighting. Maxud confirmed. A fair enough assessment, but that was an observation more fitting from a first year. Anyone else, he asked. Another student closer to the back raised his hand. Yes, Maxud said, pointing to the kid. You were able to keep seeing after Deku-san attempted to blind you because you carried wipes. Coulson. No, not Coulson, Coulson said. Maxud always had trouble with English names, and the kids noticed me not quirk didn't help with that problem. Indeed, you should always keep certain supplies to perform minor maintenance of your costume, especially for your eye gear. Maxud told them, though again, that wasn't exactly what he was looking for them to say either. Looking over the group, the students, no one else raised their hand immediately after, or in the following minute. Maxud mentally sighed and was about to call it and replay the footage when a hand was timidly raised. Jinho, he called, and the boy bit his lip, his eyes glancing at his classmates. Deku. The boy paused, his brow furrowing. Deku-Sensei didn't just use his size to win. He carefully drove and lead you to an area where you were at a clear disadvantage, and further went on to overwhelm you by cutting the power, something that would make your quirk significantly weaker. Jinho answered, his words far more confident once he remembered the proper honorific for Midoriya. Maxud smiled with a huff. It was always the quiet ones that were his favorite. That is a very good point, which is one of the reasons we drill into you how important it is to always be aware of your surroundings. Even small, mundane things like a set of sprinklers could be used to change the entire course of a fight with the right person. Quirk, or not, a simple distraction will make all the difference, and even a single second can change everything. Maxud expanded upon. Too few heroes internalize that and end up dead or forced into retirement within their first year of leaving school. Maxud told them, I've lost a lot of classmates to exactly that, but something I haven't lost a student to yet, and I don't plan on starting now. Maxud said, moving over to the screen. With the press of a button, the footage began with him and Midoriya standing in a street with a pair of guns in hand, and then giving each other a bow before the alarm of the fight starting rang throughout. And almost instantly, Midoriya stomped down on a sewer grate, causing it to flip, and he kicked it with enough force to send it flying at him in mere seconds, something that was still just as shocking as it was to watch happen as it was when the sewer grate came at him. This moment. What can you tell me about this moment, Doi? Maxud questioned, turning back to the students. Doi flinched, and her hand went back to her hair. You shouldn't underestimate your opponent, Snipe-sensei, she guessed. Yes, Deku-san doesn't have a strength quirk, but he doesn't need one to become strong enough to do the damage a minor one could do. The same could be said for any person you fight in the future. A villain with a gun quirk shouldn't be considered neutralized because they don't have a gun in their hand. A mistake like that will kill many. Maxud explained before letting the recording continue on. Midoriya, on the screen, continued to capitalize on the few seconds to slink back into the shadows, climbing up to the roofs to begin his bombardment. A mix of random debris and his paint pellets tossed by hand. Maxud quietly gulped as he watched Midoriya's careful takedown of him. Despite being one of the ones wearier of the boy capable of taming some of the scariest names out there, Midoriya was easy to relax around, and it was strong to keep his guard up when the boy rarely bared his fangs. And even if Midoriya was mostly pacifistic, the fact was Midoriya was as smart as Nezu and had years of mentally breaking people by their quirks in a simple and easy-to-manage numbers. As you can see here, none of Deku-san's moves were without purpose. Each move was made specifically to draw me nearer and nearer to the apartments here. Maxud said, and he took equal turns in both leading me and forcing my hand into retreating to where I'd be most vulnerable. He added as Midoriya jumped down, throwing a streetlight directly at his head. Maxud remembered what came next. He ducked around a corner to clean his mask when the power was cut off, and he got to watch as Midoriya merely flipped to SWCH, and he pressed the night vision cam. The cameras were bathed in green, and the outside ones could hardly be more than blank from the exposure, but almost immediately Maxud saw that after Midoriya caused him to go deeper that he wasn't jumping at nothing. because each and every time Midoriya was carefully creeping around the halls, basically circling him like a shark, something that was very unnerving to watch from the outside. The only saving grace in the whole problem was that Midoriya hadn't been behind the cat. He only took advantage of the distraction to get within arm's reach and remained perched and waiting for him to turn, both his eyes and the large combat knife seeming to glow eerily in that moment. Then, just as fast as he remembered, Midoriya leaped at him, swiping the blade just a few inches away from his neck, holding the blade downwards like for stabbing rather than upwards for a proper slash. And the pistol Midoriya had was pressed to his neck, then shot. Maksuth paused the footage once his body hit the ground, as that was as good as the demonstration over. He glanced at the timestamp and wondered how all of that could have happened in only 3 minutes and 10 seconds before turning his attention back to the students. More than a few were gapping at the footage, and Doi even held her hands over her mouth. Maksuth wasn't surprised by their reactions. Even with the training they had gotten and the experience of internships, he doubted they'd seen anything as coldly methodically as Midoriya's takedown was. And though they hadn't said it, Maksuth was sure more than one of them hadn't looked twice at Midoriya, because he was quirkless, so watching him, a well-known pro hero, get his, but handed to him by said quirkless person, was likely earth-shaking for them. "Any comments, Coulson?" he asked. The boy's mouth opened and closed. "K. How about you, Jinho?" he inquired, seeing as Jinho was more starstruck than shocked. "It's a perfect undergrounder base takedown, Snipe-sensei. Deku-Sensei isolated his target and took you completely off guard before taking the kill shot, and he caused little if any damage." Jinho answered brightly, something expected since he was planning to go underground himself. Maksuth huffed, bemused indeed. "He did," he remarked with a grin. "Any questions for Deku-san?" Maksuth asked, leaning back against the console. Jinho raised his hand eagerly. "Ah, yes, Jinho," Midoriya replied. "How come you didn't become a hero, Deku-sensei? You'd make such an incredible undergrounder," Jinho asked, and Midoriya flinched. Well, Maksuth cursed in his head. He wasn't expecting that, and apparently that's a sensitive topic, "Okay, Suds, how are you going to redirect this?" He thought, panicking slightly. Before he could think, Midoriya huffed disbelievingly as he lowered his head and shook it. "That's easy, Jinho. Being a hero would have been too restrictive, and I could do a lot more as I am now than I ever could as a hero," Midoriya answered, surprising the students. He himself was also surprised by the answer, but didn't let the students linger on it, drawing their attention back to him and continuing to analyze the recording. But he tucked the odd response in the back of his mind to bring up with the other teachers later. Shuichi was panting heavily, and his back was aching something dreadful, but he couldn't stop. "Ha ha ha ha." His entire body shuddered as he heard that laugh echo through the seemingly endless halls, and he nearly lost his grip on the ceiling. But the pain in his back was a swift reminder of why he couldn't stop no matter what. Lizzie. Shuichi felt tears prick his eyes and his heart hammer even more frantically as he scrambled even faster across the ceiling, knowing that she was catching up to him. Where could you be, Lizzie?" He felt choked then, because it felt like she had said that directly into his ear, and that momentary distraction caused him to not grab the ceiling like he should have, and he crashed to the ground and slammed into a wall. Some things had fell onto him, and he quickly shook himself and threw it all off in a rush. He scanned the room and almost at once locked on to the pair of terrifying yellow eyes he had been running from, staring right back at him. He didn't allow the demon to finish as he reared back and hissed as threateningly as he could while he pressed himself back into a corner. He was brought out his defensiveness when he heard the sound of Kaori sobbing, and with the snap back to what was going on, he realized a few things. 1. That he was not in the gloomy gray-blue dark and damp endless labyrinth. 2. He was in his room and therefore probably just had a nightmare. And 3. The person with yellow eyes was not the shapeshifter Toga, but Kaori, who was on the floor and crying. Shuichi thought, moving down from the corner, having half climbed the walls in his panic, and took Kaori in his arms and hugged her close. Hey. Imuto-chan, everything's okay," he quickly told the girl. Kaori sniffed as she tried to calm down, but didn't fight to get away from him as he curled up around her. "I am sorry, Iga-chan, but you are crying in your sleep," she whimpered into his shirt. "Oh, Imuto-chan," Shuichi muttered, feeling even more awful about this. You don't have to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. I had a really bad dream and couldn't think straight, he told her, petting her hair. She raised her head. Was it about that meanie again? She asked, and Shuichi internally cursed himself but nodded. Kaori pouted as the last of her tears fell. I wish that meanie would just leave you alone, she mumbled, burying her head into his chest. Shuichi sighed and let his head fall back and hit the wall. You and me both, kid. He thought, feeling very tired as he did. The attack had been roughly 9 months ago, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling of the shapeshifter's hold over him. It wasn't every night, but more often than not he had nightmares about her chasing him. Sometimes she caught him, or other times he woke up mid-scramble. And he knew Deku-Sensei had already taken care of her, and she'd never get near him ever again, but that didn't change how real his dreams felt. The phantom pains in his back certainly didn't help the matter. Once he was done reassuring Kaori, he sent her along her way to go get ready for the day, and he checked the time. 4 minutes, he cursed, falling back on his bed and laying his arm across his eyes, knowing he couldn't just go back to sleep again. Shuichi opened his eyes, and they slid back to the innocent-looking folder Deku-Sensei had given him about a month afterwards. He remembered how miserable Deku-Sensei looked through. The boy was trying to not show it as Deku-Sensei explained to him that under no uncertain circumstances would he ever see the shapeshifter, Toga, again. Crawling over the folder, he looked through the information and photos again. It helped somewhat, and he definitely needed it when Deku-Sensei gave it to him. It helped him humanize Toga, less of some monster from a horror movie and just a regular human that could be dealt with and stopped like anyone else. And Deku-Sensei had. Shuichi picked up the folder and stared at the picture of Toga copied over from her yearbook. She looked deceptively like a normal girl from any middle school, but even through the picture he swore there was that predatory look in them that made him feel like he needed to scratch off all of his scales. Putting it down, he stood up and looked at himself in the mirror. Well, you look like SHD. No wonder Kaori's been concerned about you. Shuichi thought, pulling down on the right side of his face. Shuichi looked somewhat gaunt, and there were even some scales of his that weren't as vibrant as the ones around them, turning slightly brown even. His hair was a mess, and his weight, lost though not concerning, was visible. When was the last time I left this room? He added, seeing as the lack of sunlight was also clear, and shook his head. He padded out and into the main area of the apartment, and he found Kaori waiting there, dejectedly poking at her bowl of cereal with her spoon. Shuichi sighed and walked over to sit with her. She brightened up as soon as she saw him and ran over to the cabinet to grab out a small container of blueberries, and immediately she held it up to him. Here, Iga-chan. I got these for you yesterday, in case you were hungry, Kaori declared. Shuichi forced himself to smile despite how his heart sank. Thanks, Amuto-chan, but I'll only eat them if you eat with me, okay? He said, and she eagerly nodded. He sat down, and they took turns eating one at a time despite his body's protests. He hadn't been able to eat as much lately. Since finishing his qualifications, he hadn't had anything to take his mind off of things aside from gaming with Comet Chaser XX. And CC was starting to get concerned for him too, since he's being chronically online now, which wasn't wrong exactly. And well, the stress of it all was making his appetite basically disappear, which was a not-so-good thing, admittedly. Speaking of food, they were probably running low. He'd have to go shopping soon, even if the idea of leaving the apartment made him unreasonably nervous. He didn't know why, but moving a lot right now always made him uneasy nowadays. Kaori was overjoyed he was going out, but didn't ask to join him either, instead choosing to run off with her friends, which he didn't have a problem with. The trip would be shorter without her there, a thought that made him feel guilty, but the faster he could get everything, the faster he could go back to his room. This thought really shouldn't be as reassuring as it was. What with how much time he was spending in there, it was starting to feel claustrophobic, but at the same time as he walked down the street, he was quickly reminded why he stayed there. Because despite wearing enough clothes to leave nothing but his snout revealed, he was drowned in the feeling that he was far too exposed and that he needed to hide away again. It didn't matter that he knew most of these people and that they had been nothing but welcoming since he got adopted by Miyake-san. He was sure that even if he had Deku-Sensei walking right beside him, he'd still feel utterly suffocated by the overlooming thought. Shuichi tried to steel himself and shook his head, taking deep breaths in order to calm his pounding heart. This wasn't his first time experiencing something like this. He felt it a lot when he still lived with his parents and subsequently never left his room unless he absolutely had to. so this time wasn't as bad as it used to. He could even leave the apartment without being dragged out, and he wasn't shaking that bad, trembling hands notwithstanding. He just wished that it wasn't so strong to keep breathing. Only taking 20 minutes had to be a shopping record of some kind, but Shuichi was simply glad he managed to be outside for that long and was fully planning on dashing straight home, but was stopped by an arm very unexpectedly wrapped around his neck. Shuichi's entire body locked up on him, and before he could do so much as scream, a familiar voice said, "Finally, come out of your cave, Zilla." There were no words for how utterly relieved Shuichi felt when Dabi spoke up. "For F's sake, Dabi, you nearly gave me a heart attack." Shuichi grumbled, feeling very glad he hadn't dropped his bags. "Well, consider us even then, for not showing your face for 3 weeks now." Dabi replied, his arm tightened, preventing him from escaping Dabi's grip. Shuichi ducked his head, swallowing thickly. "Sorry, but I've been," Shuichi tried to say, but Dabi cut him off busy. Dabi finished for him, clearly thinking of it being exactly what it sounded like, an excuse. "And you mind telling me just what's got you so busy you couldn't leave your house, and why Charlotte had to help your brat to go shopping for food?" "'Cause for some reason the blonde was certain you were sick with something, since you weren't eating and barely left your room, if what she's been saying is correct." Dabi questioned. Shuichi felt a stone be added to his stomach, mainly because even if Dabi wasn't being so ham-fisted with it, he'd still understand what Dabi was hinting at. But the feelings of being in the open in combination to the guilt was far too much for him. "Dabi, I promise I'll tell you everything, but just let's go back to the apartment, please," he quietly pleaded. Dabi didn't answer right away, and it was about an eternity before Dabi grumbled, "Fine, but you better not leave any CRP out or going to hang you, Zilla." Dabi relented, not loosening his grip, but Shuichi was just happy to be returning home. It wasn't a far walk, and Shuichi was back home and sitting across from Dabi. The brunette sat cross-legged and had his arms crossed while wearing expression on his face. Shuichi felt a twinge in his heart when he made out the 4 thin, but clearly visible scars on Dabi's face, ones he had gotten from the shapeshifter after they became him. Shuichi knew he hadn't done it and that he never would have, but at the same time it just as easily could have been him. Toga had his claws, and Shuichi was willing to bet that if he did attack Dabi, just like that, it would leave the same lines. "Well, what do you got to say for yourself?" Dabi questioned, and Shuichi flinched. Shuichi brought his knees up to his chest and hugged himself. "It's strong to explain," he replied, resisting the urge to retreat to his room. "I just can't get over what happened. I know Toga's gone. Deku-Sensei made sure of that, but I don't feel safe outside anymore." Shuichi fumbled with his words. He's never quite had to explain himself to anyone like this before. "I could make myself leave for school because the Vespas were following me, and I knew I had more than one person there for me, even though it didn't feel right to leave. But now that I've graduated, I've just been tired. I don't want to do anything, and leaving the house, it feels so wrong." He said, words trailing off as he felt like he was just whining and curled in on himself, more ducking his head. Dabi's stare was making him more uncomfortable, and the longing to escape back to his room was only growing. He knew it was pathetic to be acting like this after 9 months. Dabi sighed deeply as his head hit the wall behind him, and he rubbed the bridge of his nose, either disappointed or annoyed with him. Shuichi wasn't sure which of those things were worse. "Took called it," Dabi grumbled. "Okay, so you're having an agoraphobic rut or something?" Dabi questioned, and Shuichi blinked, staring at him. "What?" Shuichi asked back, confused. Dabi rolled his eyes, as if you becoming a hermit wouldn't work its way back to the took one way or the other. Dabi commented, and Shuichi allowed his head to hit his arms, knowing Dabi was probably right. "And naturally, he sent me a couple paragraphs to explain to me how he expected you'd react to that SHD green aoles. The lizard you're related to, or whatever, are known to feel very stressed if they don't have places to hide, and that stress keeps you from eating and makes you lazy or something, and that the lack of sun would make you feel more like SHD," Dabi grumpily explained. Shuichi blinked, his mouth opening and closing once. "Really? This is just part of my quirk?" he quietly asked. Dabi sked, rolling his eyes. "Don't ask me that, CRP. The Took and his imposters are the quirk nerds, not me," he replied, kicking Shuichi's foot. "He just told me this hermit SHD wasn't uncommon for lizards like you, and to try and get your butt out in the sun if I could, so you don't rot your bones," Dabi added, turning away from him. Shuichi bit his lip at that, Deku-Sensei had warned him about getting enough sunlight because it would likely affect his bones, and it wasn't a problem before because he liked sunbathing, but now he probably needed to take some pills or something to make up for the lack of sunbathing he's been doing. Shuichi let his head hit the wall and groaned. He hated those pills. They tasted like straight-up chalk. Dabi scoffed, if they taste that bad, it'll just be extra incentive to go outside for a bit. Dabi told him with a huff, and then got up to leave, leaving Shuichi wallow some more for voicing that last bit out loud. Isamu walked through the halls with his head lowered, seeing the edges of the students as he passed them. He continued to his destination and climbing the next flight of stairs until he came to the door to the roof and pulled out his staff key. He opened the door and let out a breath as he moved over to the small sitting area he and Hara had been using for years. Isamu took out his bento and started to pick apart the fried shrimp and fish inside, taking a bite of one or two as he pondered over the events of the past days. Little more than a week ago, the hunt for Deku-Sensei had finally been concluded, and he was absolutely nothing like any of them expected him to be. A quirkless middle schooler was incredibly different from the middle-aged man with any number of quirks attached that could help one be successful. Though he finally got an explanation for how such an extensive network was built right under their noses. Goodwill was hardly a track behavior when researching a criminal without prior history already established, something that was not in Deku-Sensei's case file, since there had been no mention of genuine charity work by the people they arrested in connection to Deku-Sensei. A second look by Nezu, however, had found that the companies related to food and other human necessities had received a major boom in business following the timeline Midoriya had given Nezu. This charity of Midoriya had led to the major drop in crime. Certainly 6% was not an enormous number overall, but that was taking all number of crimes as a whole. Theft and pickpocketing been reduced to almost nothing in an all-time low of roughly 15% of what it was. Even the rise of competent villains using Midoriya's teaching was not enough to offset all the good Midoriya was objectively doing. Sure, there was the few that robbed banks or attacked buildings, but there were also the ones that were more like activists doing petty but attention-drawing crimes to bring to light to problems. Overall, it was a change for the better in his opinion. Sure, it would be more difficult to catch some villains, but it was a small price for a move towards the better. Still, the idea of Midoriya's work in the districts was interesting. Just what was it like to teach groups of various criminals? Naturally, Midoriya's students were not all part of a gang or had committed some form of crime, but it would be extremely strong for most people to separate the ones who were from what they had done. And what about his connections to the Vespas and the Russian Vipers? The Vespas were an easy connection made from his mind's easy ability to break things, mostly quirks and people down, but where did the old and powerful Russian Vipers factor in? Perhaps he helped some higher members, but to what extent? And who for that matter? Because Midoriya was clearly held in exceedingly high regard, and the Vipers were willing to kill their own for outing him. Unfortunately, there probably wouldn't be an answer for that one without asking Midoriya himself, since the inner working of the Vipers' social hierarchy was a very confusing enigma to those outside of the deeper circles in the underground. It was supposedly led by the Morozov family, but it was strong to find good info since the group was mainly ran out of Russia with small branches in other countries. Isamu was brought out of his musings by the jiggle of the roof's door, and he tilted his head up to see who was coming up. Hara slipped past the door seconds later and walked over to where he was sitting, then sat beside him. "Otudo," she quietly greeted. "Ain't," Isamu replied in return with a slight nod. She nodded back at him, one of the few ways she could physically express herself if she remembered to, then took out her bento and held her hands over it in prayer with her eyes closed. Isamu did not have to wait for long for her to finish, and he offered her a pair of chopsticks. Have the first years been more troublesome than usual this year? Isamu inquired. No. Brooklyn was an outlier. The rest of the classes are being calmer than usual. Hara answered. Isamu hummed, bad news for Shoyuta then. Was hoping that next year's class wouldn't be full of problem children, he commented. I thought I was one superstitious one between the two of us. Otudo, Hara asked, and he rolled his eyes. You are, but the universe's oddly vindictive focus on Shoyuta is strong to ignore, he told her, and Hara nodded back agreeing. Yes, your Couchy does often find himself on the wrong side of luck. Hara conceded. Isamu did not say anything about how Hara hesitated to call Shoyuta his Couchy, There were more important things to discuss than his feelings for and relationship with the man. What are your thoughts on Midoriya-san? Isamu questioned. Hara did not say anything right away, choosing to finish chewing some rice before answering. He is holding up more than I expected. Hara answered. He tilted his head. Oh, how so? Isamu inquired. Midoriya is stressed, but not about work. Not quite sure where it's from, but it certainly isn't from work. Or the protesters, since there weren't any spikes when they were brought up. Hara explained in between bites. Isamu pursed his lips. Well, working in the districts would bring stress to most, he conceded, but Hara shook her head. It's not from his work. He's excited or content when it's brought up, she corrected. I suppose. Have you felt anything related to what the data said? Isamu asked. He was not the most informed on the topic, but he did know that the recent generations of quirkless kids did not have it easy. Hara took another bite before speaking. His mind is much healthier speaking in that matter. I haven't felt any suicidal impulses or self-harm so far. No shame about being quirkless either. Hara commented. That's rare. Isamu responded, letting his head tilt back to stare at a bird circling above them. Yes, it is, especially at his age. Hara added before moving on to the noodles inside, and a soft slurp as she ate them. Isamu also took a moment to eat a bit more before asking, what about our co-workers? Hara's eyes became half-lidded. Ryokuen, Ken, Kiyama, and Yamada are concerned about him. Ken because of his pain tolerance, and the other three because of what Izuku has said to them. Hara told him. Isamu raised an eye at that. Midoriya might not have those kind of impulses or active thoughts. But he used to, from what I overheard from Yamada and Kiyama whispering about in a corner, and Ryokuen simply told me about his concerns with Midoriya's familiarity of losing his students to tragedies. Hara continued to say. Isamu let his head hang at that as he pondered the thought. He's probably lost more than we'll ever know, Isamu stated. Indeed, Ototo. Hara agreed. So, you approve of Imane? Isamu guessed, and she turned to him as a teacher, he clarified. Hara turned back to her lunch. He's been a positive influence so far. Miyake and his friends are the most taken with him so far, she answered, and Isamu nodded with a hum. That would make the most sense. Miyake used to be tutored by Midoriya in middle school and would therefore be far accepting of the boy, as someone well-informed. Isamu mused, letting his head fall slightly to the side. And if Miyake does something, the rest of his class will follow if they haven't already. Hara commented, and Isamu nodded. Class 2, was trying to be more discreet about it, but it was clear to everyone that Miyake was unquestionably the leader of the class. Sure, he wasn't the president of even the vice, but all of his classmates could see he had the best instincts for heroics. However, the kids were hardly stealthy about it, even if it didn't happen as much with them becoming more confident. Shame Tubi doesn't have someone like that. Can you still pop it on them? He inquired, and Hara let her head fall back as she looked up to the sky thinking. Yes, you're still worried about them, she answered, and Isamu hummed lowly. Considering we still don't know the depths of the bullying Togadakuen faced, I'd like to know whether there are any other outliers we should be worried about. Isamu responded. Fair enough. She conceded, and the two of them fell into a lull of silence as they finished their respective meals. Speaking of concerns, Hara said, and he hummed back in acknowledgement. How is Oswald holding up? She asked. Ah, Isamu commented, the boy is still troubled. Rio hasn't been able to dig up what yet, though Rio is fairly certain that it isn't related to his family issues, he explained with a bit of a wave of his hand. Are you still planning to use your license to foster the boy? Hara questioned. Isamu leaned away from her with a tense hum. He had been considering it, and though Rio could not say anything detailed about Oswald's home situation, he knew it was not good since Rio informed them that the boy would prefer to go by his first name. Plus, the student files were easy enough to look through. As for choosing to foster him, well, he was as good as any other option on the staff, and it wasn't the first time the staff had to foster/adopt a student due to an uneasy home life, but Nezu had allowed it to happen far more often than previous principals according to Haruki-san. Well, Rio could not unless he wanted to stop being Oswald's counselor and start a hunt for a new one. I plan to approach him later today about it. I don't know if he'll accept, but I believe he'd benefit from knowing he has another way out. Isamu finally answered. Hara stared at him before facing forward again. I see. Well, you do have the space for him at least. Would you be switching over to desk work if he accepts? Hara inquired as she tidied up. For the first month, I think I will, to evaluate, so to speak. Oswald is almost an adult and wouldn't need as much attention as a toddler would, so I might be able to go back to light duty earlier than that. Isamu mused. Well, I hope all goes well if you Otudo, Hara stated before standing and moving to leave him up on the roof by himself. Isamu exhaled and leaned backhand wrist to glance at the sky, flinching as the light burned his sensitive eyes, but managed to see some blue before ducking his head and covering his eyes with both hands. Shortly after school ended for the day, Isamu walked across the grounds towards the P.E. grounds, knowing he would find Oswald and his friends. Indeed, there were the 6 who were working on their quirks on the field aside from Togata, who was doing laps like he had for every other after school. He waited on the side for a few seconds for one to notice him. Surprisingly, it was not Miyake that saw him first, but Hato as she worked on her double jumping. She had turned in his direction and squeaked, "Ah, Sensei, what are you doing here?" Hato exclaimed as she made a wobbly landing, arms swing to keep her balance. Amajiki, Miyake, Oswald, and Heia stopped to look at him, clearly confused about why he was apologizes for interrupting. "But I can borrow Oswald for a few moments," Isamu asked, sliding his hands into his pockets. Miyake and Hato both tilted their heads while Amajiki and Heia glanced back at the pinkette. Oswald huffed and sked, grabbing a water bottle, and sulked over to him. Yeah, whatever, let's just get this over with so I can get back to training," Oswald gruffly said, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. "It will be quick," Isamu assured, following Oswald over to the nearby equipment shed, and the boy sat down on a bench before tilting his head back to chug about half the bottle. Isamu waited for the boy to finish before he spoke. He would rather not risk the boy choking on the water, no matter how small a chance it was. "So," Oswald started wiping at his mouth after he pulled the bottle away from his mouth. "What's this about Sensei?" the boy questioned. "Oswald, you're aware that most of the staff are trained heroes, myself included, correct?" Isamu asked back, and the pinkette scowled back at him. "Yeah," Oswald replied, irate. "So, you understand the reason for why I want to know if you feel safe at home, Oswald?" Isamu commented. Oswald's scowl got bigger, and he'd sked, jutting his head up. "It ain't paradise, but it ain't a complete doghouse either, Sensei," Oswald told him, leaning back and away from him, his voice a touch more clipped as he said it. Isamu blinked, Oswald's defensive deflection almost exactly parroting Shuta's back in the day. Not word for word, mind you, but certainly close enough to see why Namiri called him the pastel punk Shoyuta always wanted to be deep down. "I see. So you wouldn't be interested in becoming a ward of you, eh?" Isamu drawled, letting his head fall to the side. Oswald's head snapped up to him. "What the F are you talking about?" Oswald questioned. Isamu hummed back, "As I'm sure you know, when your parents signed the paperwork for your enrollment into you, they gave us, the staff as a whole, partial custody of you," Isamu mentioned, "and if we were to determine that one of our students wasn't safe at home, we could legally remove said student from the home, and they'd be fostered by one of the staff, barring the counselors," he explained further. Oswald's eyes bore holes in him. Are you serious?" the boy asked, and Isamu nodded. "Very. Of course your parents would have the right to take us to court for guardianship, though they rarely, when giving students, are legally old enough to voice which parent they wish to stay with," Isamu admitted. Oswald was still staring at him. "And that extends to students who voice they don't feel safe at home either. Do keep that in mind, Oswald," Isamu added before turning on his heel, and left the boy to think about it without him looming over him. Izuku found himself working away on some theories in his notebook for the students during lunch. Normally he'd be eating with Haruki-san, but she was busy with an appointment, so he was on his own for the day. And Izuku was planning on catching up on his analysis for all of the Hero Course students. He had quite a few updates to make after observing another heroics exercise. But he hardly got one page in when he got a text alert and quickly checked his phone. Nezu, "Hello Midoriya," smiley face. "Apologies for interrupting. However, I wish to extend an offer for you to join me in my office for a cup of tea." Izuku blinked, tilting his head as he considered the idea. Nezu was fairly interested in quirk theory, since he seemed to keep up with Izuku during dinner that one time, so Izuku could probably have some decent conversation if nothing else, and it was nice to bounce ideas off of people that weren't himself. But Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, given Nezu-san's only company were students and their teachers, and Izuku wasn't trying to be crude. But Nezu-san likely didn't have anyone to have an in-depth intellectual conversation. So maybe that was it and Nezu-san just was bored. However, Izuku didn't think that was it either. Well, not the main reason anyways. No, Izuku had, for better or worse, suspected that Nezu was hoping to get more information from Izuku about All for One. Of course, it could just be the paranoia of the man getting to him, but Izuku would have to be an idiot to forget that the whole reason he accepted his job here was because he played his hand and revealed he had quote-unquote inside knowledge on All for One. And he technically did have because of and his students' warnings. And while he'd be willing to risk indulging Nezu-san for some more solid plans to deal with All for One and help Tenko, Izuku wouldn't be able to give him full disclosure because of his promise to. Izuku could dance around it for a while probably, but eventually he'd have to Nezu-san. He couldn't name his sources or give him all the information. So Izuku weighed his options, then sighed and packed up his stuff. As risky as it was, Izuku would redoubtable fare much better with Nezu at being more read in on the situation. And frankly, Izuku knew he'd need to take every advantage he could to keep All for One from making him disappear. Izuku walked towards Nezu-san's office, and this time noted that Nezu-san hadn't said anything despite his habit of welcoming someone to come inside. In most cases, he would consider this irrelevant info, but Nezu-san was being somewhat vulnerable by doing this. Elmo Vespa had been the one to explain to Izuku the difference in being invited in and actually being someone's guest. Izuku supposed the thought had roots on the more animal side of the psyche than he guessed if Nezu-san also used this system. Izuku knocked on the door and got confirmation to enter before he peeked his head in. Much like before the meeting with the Winnows, Nezu chose to sit himself down on one of the couches, a pot of tea on the table. Please come on in, Midoriya. Nezu-san encouraged, his tail lazily wagging behind him. He fully entered and sat himself across from Nezu-san, taking one of the two offered cups of tea and taking a small sip, only to pause when the taste of it hit his tongue. Izuku's eyes fluttered. Is this ZHOT? Izuku asked, still a bit shocked, and took another sip to confirm. Nezu-san chirped in confirmation. Indeed, Midoriya. A bit more difficult to get a hold of with the high caffeine levels in it, but I've been informed that the quirkless like yourself have a much higher tolerance to it. Nezu-san further explained. He wasn't wrong. Only a small percentage of quirk people could have the same level of caffeine. Quirkus always went on and on about how much more evolved they were compared to Two Toes, but that always seemed to conveniently forget that they lost the tolerance Two Toes had to caffeine, capsaicin, and even liquor if the message boards he read were correct. Two Toes. Izuku corrected and Nezu-san blinked, one of his ears flicking. It's our preferred term. We prefer to be called Two Toes instead of quirkless. Izuku clarified. Apologizes Midoriya. I was unaware, but I shall be certain to call you as such from now on. Nezu-san told him, and Izuku chuckled. It's all right, Nezu-san, it's a name we gave ourselves, and we aren't in the habit of spreading it around either. So most people aren't aware of it, so we don't mind being referred to as quirkless outside of polite company. Izuku explained, waving the issue away before taking another sip. Nezu-san chirped again, naturally Midoriya. Nezu-san replied, his tail wagging a bit faster. Izuku raised an eye but shrugged it off in his head and drank about half before he set down his cup. While I appreciate the offer, Nezu-san, I would like to skip the small talk and cut to the real reason for why you've called me here. Izuku told him. Nezu-san's ears drooped a bit. You've seen through me, Midoriya. I do want for us to discuss more pleasant subjects over tea in the future. However, there is a far more pressing issue that requires our attention. Nezu-san admitted, setting down his own cup. Izuku sighed. Knew it. Izuku thought just a touch bitter. He was somewhat hoping that he was wrong and that the two of them could just prattle on about the students' quirks. Nezu-san's tail had stopped wagging now, and he was a fair more dour before he spoke up. As I'm sure you've aware, I have cameras all over you, and have overheard your conversations with Haruki-san. Nezu said, and Izuku remained as he was, unsure whether or not he should be worried where Nezu-san was taking this yet. Nezu gave a reassuring series of chirps. Now, Midoriya. I'm not asking you to tell me everything. I understand the need for plausible deniability as much as anyone else, and if it helps, I'm aware of part of the story already due to Tsukachi bringing me into the fold on One for All side. Nezu-san explained. Izuku's nose scrunched up at that, One for All. Don't tell me that's what you've been calling his brother's quirk. Izuku commented, and Nezu-san blinked again. Izuku held up a hand. Sorry, it's just to have your quirk named as a mirror for the brother who probably abused and mostly likely killed you after fighting each other for years is a bit tone-deaf and probably an ill-fitting description. Izuku told Nezu-san. Nezu-san's nose also scrunched up. Yes, I believe in that light. You are correct. What have you been calling it? Nezu-san inquired. Izuku shrugged. I didn't have one. But given its ability, I was considering either heirloom or inheritance, with how its main feature was that it could be willingly passed on to another, but only by the current holder's choice, and couldn't be stolen. Izuku explained. Nezu-san should nodding his head. Inheritance would probably be the most fitting between the two, since an heirloom wouldn't grow and change in the same way. Nezu-san mused with a light scratch under his chin. Afraid my knowledge of inheritance isn't much. Haven't had the pleasure of speaking with anyone who personally knew a holder and was read in on it. Izuku confessed, and Nezu-san should again. Given the holder's paranoia, I'm not surprised there isn't more about it out there. I'd be happy to read you in on what I've been told of it, but we should get back to what we were talking about in the first place. Yes, Nezu-san prompted gently. Izuku pursed his lips. He probably could use the clause about not ratting on his students to force Nezu-san to back off if asking him to drop it wouldn't work, but Tenko wouldn't be that strong to find since the Shimura massacre's info wasn't private. At the same time, Izuku felt a surge of protectiveness flare up inside of him, though. Tenko was by all rights an adult, but he was also heavily abused by All for One in order for him to be a useful pawn in his plans, and was mentally speaking closer to someone his age, and was his friend in all but name. So Izuku was of course protective of him. A respect that was clearly returned in kind since Tenko was doing the best he could to protect him in kind from the man he viewed as his personal savior and father figure, despite knowing the exact consequences he could face if his actions were ever discovered. Izuku exhaled through his nose and let his head fall all the way back as his mind went back and forth on whether or not to tell Nezu-san about Tenko. Izuku fixed his eyes wearily on Nezu-san. Is this room a dead zone, Nezu-san? Izuku tersely questioned, and Nezu didn't hesitate to jump from his seat, then ran to a corner of the room on all fours. Izuku watched Nezu gone ahead to assumedly lock down the room with his body, pointedly not blocking Izuku's view of how he was doing so. As sign of his trust in Izuku, it is now Midoriya. Nezu-san assured. Nezu-san, you understand that whatever I tell you cannot leave this room. I will not risk my students' safety under any circumstances, and will not be going any further with this, if you can't swear to me that what we're about to discuss will stay between us. Izuku sternly told Nezu-san. I swear on my littermate's Midoriya that not one word will leave this room. Nezu-san promised, clearly seeing how serious Izuku was. Izuku took a deep breath and released a much longer sigh as he forced his shoulders to relax and stared at the cooling tea with a frown. Do you have anything stronger, Nezu-san? Like Ramon? Izuku asked, apparently surprising Nezu-san because he blinked twice in response. Yes. And considering we're about to share a drink together, I think we can both drop the honorifics Midoriya. Nezu-san said as he dug out a bottle much like the one Jared-san gave him, but was lemon-flavored instead. Izuku merely nodded and quickly took a sip of the drink. Once he took it from Nezu-san, Izuku hummed at the taste. Still not a favorite, but considering Izuku didn't want to become an alcoholic, it was probably for the best that he didn't like the taste. Okay. What I told you and Sakachi-san back the station was mostly true for obvious reason, but as I'm sure you've realized, I wasn't giving you everything. Izuku lead with, and Nezu-san chirped in reply. About the end of July last year, I was walking home from work and not quite in the best mood, so when I walked through a portal and into a base, I could have handled things a lot worse than I did, but I managed to walk away unscathed and with another student. Izuku began and took another sip. This student, I later learned, was known as Shigaraki Tamura, and Kirojiri was the one who responsible for the portals, two people known to be deep inside of All for One's inner circle. You can probably imagine how terrified I was when I learned this. Izuku explained, and Nezu nodded silently, encouraging him to continue his pause, digging into the couch. Izuku huffed. It was a very good thing that Tamura was independently looking for help with leveling up, as he put it, and that All for One had no clue what he was doing, or neither of us would be standing here, Nezu. Izuku commented. And while the situation was tense at first, I noticed that Tamura and I were wearing the same shoes. So I did some digging and realized that Tamura was actually Shimura Tenko, Shimura Nana's brainwashed grandson, who was formerly a Two-Toes himself. Izuku explained. Nezu-san's ear flicked, and he blinked. Why keep Tenko alive? Nezu-san questioned. That is what I asked Kurogiri. Tenko is merely a pawn to mentally break down All Might. Weaponizing his mentor's grandchild to the point they would be forced to kill each other is petty, but in line for him. And from what I'm told, we Two-Toes are the perfect cattle for All for One, so once he's done with his revenge, Tenko's body will still be useful to them. Izuku elaborated. Nezu-san reeled back with his huckles raised cattle. Nezu-san near-hissed, and Izuku huffed. A quirk body is built for housing the specific quirk the person was born with. Their bodies could manage only having one other quirk and surviving for another, 20 years, brain damage notwithstanding. Izuku told Nezu much like how Kurogiri explained to him. A Two-Toes, on the other hand, can safely hold 10 to 25 depending on how old they are and their health. They'll be brain dead after 4, but that just makes training them easier, which makes Two-Toes like me cattle in his eyes. Izuku said much calmer, as he explained it with having months to get used to the idea. That is, Nezu-san growled vile. Izuku finished for him, then nodded. I'm treading a very dangerous line by working so closely to him. Kurogiri is a Nomu that isn't brain dead, but under a control quirk, and would be forced to out me if All for One ever asked about me to him directly. Izuku told Nezu-san, as he continued on. Despite knowing this, I've not stopped contact with either of them, because I think I can save both Tenko and Kurogiri from All for One, and have been slowing de-brainwashing Tenko, and I have no plans of stopping Nezu. Izuku firmly said, all but challenging Nezu-san to protest his decision. Nezu-san's tail flicked to the other side of him. If you believe both of them could be saved, why not quietly extract them and do so away from All for One instead? I could help you do so. Mito dash. Nezu-san's offer was cut off by Izuku's loud scoff. Because Kurogiri has orders not to allow that to happen. Tenko can't leave Japan with All for One directly ordering it, or Kurogiri will teleport him and any accomplices straight to him. Izuku said bitterly. Izuku had asked such questions as soon as he got the stomach to do so. As for the brainwashing, it's actually very easy to break if I showed or pointed something out to Tenko that doesn't match with the memories All for One put in his head, and the illusion will be shattered. But again, Kurogiri has direct orders to immediately alert All for One and tell him what cause was so he can get rid of it and reuse the brainwashing quirk on Tenko while he's still in shock. Izuku added before taking a much larger swig. Kurogiri had been generous to tell Izuku all of the things forbidden by All for One once Izuku asked, because he didn't fancy all of his strong work to go down the drain by a slip of the tongue. Nezu-san's tail began irately swishing behind him, hence why you must be so careful in your approach towards Tenko, and who knows about this? Nezu-san commented. Indeed. Izuku confirmed Kurogiri doesn't have any immediate orders for if Tenko just runs away surprisingly. In fact, he has a full 24 hours to look for him before he has to report the incident. I'm aiming for that to happen so that I can knock out Kurogiri, which will give me a grace PRD, to get them away and de-brainwash before All for One notices. Izuku elaborated. Nezu-san's ear flicked. Even if you were to do that, it would be very easy for All for One to reuse the quirk on. Then once he did, All for One likely has more than one teleportation quirk under his belt. Nezu-san pointed out. Izuku's grip on the bottle tightened, and he turned his gaze down to his lap. While All for One survived the battle, he was greatly injured, and in addition to being wheelchair and support machine bound, All for One is blind. I plan on using that to my advantage to kill All for One with Kurogiri's help. Izuku said. Even without looking, Izuku could feel Nezu-san freeze into place. I just need to aim my gun and Kurogiri to open a portal directly next to All for One's forehead, and he'll be gone. Nezu. 2 seconds max. Speed quirks or not, he wouldn't be able to dodge or use a quirk. Izuku spoke, the cold clawing feeling of dread building in his guts as he admitted his plan to Nezu-san. Silence engulfed the two of them, making Izuku feel all the worse for what he just said, as if finally saying it out loud made the fact he was planning murder someone real to him. Unable to stand the feelings trying to tear him apart from the inside out, he finished the rest of the bottle in one last chug, then shakily exhaled. and Izuku had to swallow the lump that formed in his throat before he could find his words again. We both know that locking up All for One would be impossible, Nezu. And with how long he's been around, he has plenty of countermeasures for anything we could throw at him. This is probably the closest chance we have at killing him, Izuku said, justifying himself, and what he was going to do, leaving his mouth feeling like it was coated in arsenic. Finally, Izuku raised his head and leveled a tired, world-weary glare at Nezu, knowing this. "Are you going to stop me, Nezu?" Izuku questioned. Nezu, for his part, didn't react for a very long time. Or maybe it was Izuku's warped perception of time, but he'd swear Nezu sat there completely still for 5 minutes. "No, Izuku, I will not stop you," Nezu slowly said, his words as thick in the air as they were on his tongue. Izuku nodded in his thanks, unbothered by Nezu using his given name. Confessing conspiracy to commit murder was a very intimate thing after all, and being on a first-name basis with Nezu wouldn't kill him any more than the Ramun would. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at U.A. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Bloomer Bill for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.